Welcome to the Nexa front lawn for this next session, The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. Just before we begin, we will facilitate one more Zomato hot seat giveaway. If you're seated and you have a big red sticker on the back of your chair, you are the winner of a prize. Please do come to the front and we will give you a goodie bag from Zomato, our sponsor, one of the sponsors for this year's the Jaipur Literature Festival. Do we have a winner of the Zomato hot seat? Yes? Can I see the sticker? Congratulations. Our volunteer is waiting here to give you your prize. So this next session is presented to you by Rajasthan Patrika, the Leadership Series. It will feature Hallie Rubenhold in conversation with B. Rowlatt. Hallie Rubenhold is a best-selling author, social historian, broadcaster, and historical consultant for TV and film. Her most recent book, The Five, has won the Baillie Gifford Prize and is shortlisted for the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger. It is the first biography of the 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, and it reclaims the narrative in favour of the women rather than the murderer. She will be appearing in conversation with B. Rowlatt, a writer and journalist whose award-winning travelogue, In Search of Mary, was a biography of the year. She co-wrote the bestseller Talking About Jane Austen in Baghdad, which was dramatised by the BBC and is one of Virago's 50 Shades of Feminism. Presented by Rajasthan Patrika, please join me in welcoming to the stage Hallie Rubenhold and B. Rowlatt.
Hello, hello. Oh, good afternoon, Jaipur. You're in for a treat. We've got Hallie. A massive welcome, please. This is an extraordinary work, and it was the first one. It was the first book that I got asked to talk about here at Jaipur, and I was very, very excited. But before we launch into it, Hallie, how many prizes have you won lately?
2.
She's won all the prizes. You've had such a run. You've had such a phenomenal year. This book has really shaken things up. So I just want you to know that this book is the talk of everywhere. And we're going to get to know it a little bit more. So the first line that I heard about it, and this is from the publicity, is about the victims of Jack the Ripper, the notorious killer. And what Hallie's done is round out these victims into women. And that is the key part of their story, because they died because they were in the wrong place and the wrong time. But their greatest misfortune is that they were born women. And we're going to be looking into some of the politics and the sociology of that. But first of all, and most importantly, I'd love you, please, to introduce us to a couple of the characters. I've got my favourites. Are you allowed a favourite? I don't know.
Yeah, you're allowed to have a favourite.
Go on, who's your favourite?
Well, it's like mothers with their children. I mean, I could never choose a favourite because each one of them is very different, and I have very personal experience writing about each one of them. So why don't you tell me which your favourite is?
I have a real soft spot for Annie.
Yes.
Annie tries really hard to improve herself. She moves up in the world. She struggles with addiction. And I also found that maybe it's the luck of your research, but you found so many ways into her life. So could you introduce us to the story of Annie?
Sure. I think first I'll start by saying I'll introduce you to the 5 women themselves and who they are, and their names. So the first victim was a woman called Marianne or Polly Nichols, and then Annie Chapman, and then Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And I like to say, if you take anything away from these sessions, when I talk about this book, take away their names, remember who they are, because for 131 years, nobody cared who they were. And now we're able to talk about them. We're able to read their stories. And that is incredibly important, because it used to be just about Jack the Ripper. And when you hear these women's stories now, you can never go back to just thinking about the story of Jack the Ripper, which starts with their deaths.
Yeah.
It's not about them. And this way we can turn it on its head. So, Annie, what were you going to say?
Well, no, actually, no. Let's jump back a bit. I've got too eager. Let's not start with Annie. We need to set the scene, the autumn of terror, this year and what happened in London. And for people, I mean, you've all heard the name, right? You've all heard of Jack the Ripper. What are the headlines of that particular autumn of terror?
Well, a lot of people are really surprised to learn that, and I hate saying this, Jack the Ripper only killed 5 people, 5 women. Only 5 women. Well, I mean, killing anybody is bad enough, but 5 I think is pretty bad. That all happened between the 31st of August, 1888, and the 9th of November, 1888, which was a period of time in which Jack the Ripper was just on the streets, very elusive. Nobody knew when he was going to strike. He was causing panic and terror in the hearts of everybody in the East End of London, but also all over London as well, and all over Britain. And in fact, the story became so enormous that it traveled around the world. And every newspaper around the world carried the stories of these murders.
Why?
Because it was so sensationalist, but also it seems these murders intersected with a time in history which coincided with the development of what we might think of as tabloid journalism or the sensationalist press. And so especially in London, journalists were looking for a story, and if it bleeds, it leads, as we say in the UK. And this was no exception to that.
And it was more than that.
This became a story of bad women getting what they deserved. So this story accorded very well with the morality of the time, which was if a woman steps out of line, if a woman does something that that contravenes the norms for society, she will be punished. And so a lot of the ways in which the stories were construed were to make it look as if these women were in part responsible for their own demise. And this is where the label prostitute comes in.
We're going to come to that, so I don't want you to explore that too much right now, because that's a very key part of this exploration. But you've set the scene. There's a killer on the loose. There's a media frenzy with a sort of prurient, almost pornographic gaze upon these events as they develop. Also, and we will get to Annie, and we will get to the characters, but set the scene of London, and this is Dickens' land, isn't it?
Yes,
that we're talking about?
It is. I mean, one of the interesting things about the women is we tend to think, Jack the Ripper, first of all, is one of our major cultural exports. And in Britain, I think, to be honest, that's something slightly to be ashamed of. We send Downton Abbey out into the world, Agatha Christie, Henry VIII, Sherlock Holmes, but there's something about Jack the Ripper that just seems to have stuck in the public imagination internationally, so that when people come to London, they come to London to do Jack the Ripper walks, to engage in all of this. And now I completely forgot what you had asked.
See, what I wanted to get to was, you've done a huge amount of work, and you've actually gone to some of the sources that Dickens himself used.
Yes, that's right.
In the portrayal of, I want you to bring to life the streets where these women were working. I want to visit the workhouse.
Yes.
There's extraordinary existences that people lived, and, and give us a sense of the milieu of these women.
Exactly. The point I was going to make before I started wandering off on vaguely, I don't want to say not an unrelated tangent, was that many people think that the lives of these women were just, when we imagine Jack the Ripper, we think of this one point in time, the late Victorian era, 1888. But these women's lives were all about Victorian London. They were as much Dickens, who was writing in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, as they were about the end of the century. These women's lives spanned almost entirely the reign of Queen Victoria, which is extraordinary. So their lives parallel Queen Victoria's. And one of the things I do in the introduction of my book is to give a picture of London at this time. It's a tale of two cities, basically. You have everything we like to imagine about London. This city full of, wealthy people riding around in carriages, and a celebration of Queen Victoria's Jubilee with, balls and, beautiful gowns and things like that. And then you have the flip side of that, which is poverty at a level which in the modern era in Britain is not seen. People who
draw us a picture of the poverty.
A picture of this, of what it was like to live. Well, for those of you who have been to London, you will know the layout of the city, and that obviously you have the very posh parts, which are like Knightsbridge and Mayfair, and then you have the East End. But all around London, you tend to think, here today, we tend to think that, you have a good part of the city and a bad part of the city, but you had pockets of poverty all over. It wasn't just Whitechapel. So you had people living, entire families, 7, 8 people living in one room, 8 by 10 feet. There was no running water. People used wastewater to cook with, to bathe in. They got very sick. The chimneys often didn't work and smoked, and people had lots of respiratory problems. There was a lot of crime. The plumbing didn't work. People were starving. And this was the realities of life for very, very, very many people.
And part of this Victorian era was also a sense that, of the deserving poor. And there's a particularly brilliant chapter here on the austere edifice of the workhouse. And you introduce this by describing the Poor Law Amendment Act, which is a piece of legislation brought in basically to punish poor people. It addresses what the government saw as the abuse of charitable relief. The poor were judged to be lazy and immoral paupers who refused to do honest work, bred bastards in enormous families while living off handouts. So this is what the authorities saw. The poor laws were enacted. What followed?
And what happened, I think those of you who are familiar with Victorian literature, and especially Dickens, there's a lot of talk about the workhouse.
Yeah.
Well, what was the workhouse? People lived in terror of the workhouse, of going to the workhouse. If you were poor, if you couldn't afford food for your family, if you didn't have a job, if you couldn't afford lodgings, you had to turn yourself over to the parish, so the local authority, who would house you in this big kind of dormitory, separate the men from the women. The very young children could stay with the women, but the slightly older children were taken away from their parents and put into an industrial school. And then everybody had to do, the men had to do very hard manual labor, sometimes breaking stones. The women had to do something called picking oakum, which was pulling apart with their hands old ship's rope, and cleaning and this sort of thing.
This follows their having been stripped. Their personal possessions are taken away. So it's a very humiliating process.
It was designed to humiliate, and you were made to take a bath in dirty water that everybody else had bathed in. You slept in a large dormitory, which was filled with lice and rats and fleas. And it was a terrible, terrible existence. And it was meant to humiliate and mortify those people who were committed to the workhouse.
So it's worth bearing in mind that this is the background, this is the very real terror, that people whose lives were precarious, and ultimately these women's lives, they all lived in a state of very advanced precariousness.
Yes.
And this is the background, and they all spent time in and out of the workhouses, as did their children and their families.
Many of them did. There were some who didn't. And Annie Chapman, and this is a very good way of telling Annie's story, in fact. Annie Chapman was one of the fortunate ones who, there are no workhouse records that indicate that she was in a workhouse at any given time. Annie, like all of these women, and each of these women's stories, as I was mentioning, is totally individual. But the thing that is so gripping about Annie's story is that Annie, unlike the others, her family started to move up and they moved into the lower middle classes. And Annie's father had been a soldier in a very prestigious regiment, the 2nd Regiment of the Life Guard, who, if you go to London now, they're the ones in the silver breastplates sitting on the horses outside of Whitehall. And then her father became a gentleman's valet afterwards. And when I say gentleman's valet, you can understand his status when I compare him to Mr. Carson on Downton Abbey. He was like Mr. Carson. And then
I can just add, they were so fancy that they actually had their own portrait
yes,
made
Annie,
here.
And there she is with her husband, John Chapman.
Which not everybody gets.
Not everybody got a portrait, and there was a lot of ambition in that portrait as well, in what they were wearing, the way they presented themselves. But when she got married, she married another very high-standing servant. So John Chapman was a gentleman's coachman. So he was like the driver in Downton Abbey, if you can imagine that. And so they led 4 people of their class quite a good standard of life. They had their own house. He worked for a land gentleman who had a country estate outside of Windsor, and they had their own cottage on the estate. And they even had money to send their daughters to a girls' school. But the tragedy in all of this was that Annie was an alcoholic. She suffered from alcoholism. And she was committed to one of the first women's rehabilitation centers in England. And she was there for a year, and she came out and she relapsed. And eventually she and her husband had to separate, and he sent her back to her family in London, and they fell out because they were teetotalers. And then Annie gradually found her way to Whitechapel with a new partner.
So from having been, outwardly very respectable and on a very upwardly socially mobile trajectory, how does she fall through the gaps?
Well, it's very sad. It's alcoholism. It's a story of alcoholism. And in fact, alcoholism is, I would say, much more the unifying factor in all of these women's stories than anything else. I mean, poverty and alcoholism. There was no way around it. And also, she had inherited this from her father. Her father had been an alcoholic. So although he had a very good job, he ended up killing himself. And her brother became an alcoholic as well.
So how do we chart her journey from leafy Windsor down into London's East End?
How did it happen? Well, her descent begins really when she went to rehab and she couldn't pull herself out again. And then she was sent back to her mother and her sisters, who had taken the abstinence pledge. They were teetotalers. And she fell out with them. And she had basically said, after this experience in rehab, I am never going to be cured. I must always have the drink. And it's best if you leave me alone. One of the things that makes her story, but a lot of these women's stories, so incredibly sad, is shame. It's the shame of society. It's the shame that comes from families. When an individual has failed, society and the family shames them. And I think obviously one of the things that we have learned in the 21st century is you cannot help somebody and shame them at the same time. And I think that's, a desperate tragedy.
And I suppose for women in the Victorian setting above all, the ultimate shame of being an unfit mother. Having your children removed from you. So all of this compounded the abject state.
Yes. Well, because if you think about, in the Victorian era, women were designed to serve one purpose. And that was basically to be wives and mothers and carers. And if you had failed in the Victorian perception, if you had somehow failed at being a mother, so if you were an alcoholic, if you had mental illness, if you did anything which made you not the perfect woman, the ideal woman at home, with a husband or a father to look after you, you had contravened the norms, the feminine norms, and you were seen as a broken woman. The interesting thing about this is that Victorian society conflated the broken woman with the sexually immoral woman, with the fallen woman. So once you were damaged goods, in one way you were damaged goods, your moral character was destroyed. It was completely blackened. So if you were an alcoholic, it was believed you were probably also a prostitute.
The fallen woman, explore that trope more, because that's, I mean, all throughout Christian mythology, that's a huge, huge trope that's been there to beleaguer women. But it comes to the fore in Victorian literature.
It really does. And I mean, again, you know, if a woman was believed throughout history to have any sexual knowledge outside of marriage, she was seen as damaged goods. I mean, there is a very practical reason why this belief evolved, which is until fairly recently, we didn't have any effective birth control. And if a woman has had sex outside of marriage, then the man who basically owns her, because it was a situation of a woman being legal property for most of history, a man does not know if the woman is damaged goods or not, and he does not know if she is carrying his legitimate issue.
They're such terrible terms, fallen woman and damaged goods. They're just horrific terms.
We must remember that women were property for most of history. And that is why we have, this is why the women in this book find themselves in the situations they do. It's also very interesting. One of the things I discovered while I was researching this was about the state of women and how Victorians viewed the fallen women. They had a number of, you can imagine, rescue shelters, rehabilitation centers for women who had been involved in sex work, for women who had been men's mistresses, for women who had had sexual knowledge outside of marriage. And the interesting thing is, these rescue centers were open to three types of women. So two I've just mentioned, women who worked in prostitution, women who had sexual knowledge, may have been a man's mistress, but the third was a woman who had been a victim of incest was also deemed the same as a prostitute because she had had illicit sexual knowledge.
And this, like the workhouse, was this some kind of Victorian punishment centre?
Well, it was believed
masquerading as reform.
Well, some did offer punishment, but most attempted to rehabilitate. And in the case of poor women, I mean, whether you go into the workhouse, whether you go into what was in the 18th century called a Magdalene Center, you were being retrained to be reintegrated into society if you were a poor woman as a servant. A servant was the only Being a servant, domestic service was the only way in which a poor woman could have any control of her life professionally or, even outside marriage. So it was the only hope. So for example, these children, as I mentioned, when families were sent in the workhouse and children were taken away and put into industrial schools, the boys were given a trade. The girls were taught to go into domestic service. So, because, actually, this was the best you could hope for. A girl could enter domestic service. She could enter as a maid, and she could work her way up to be either a housekeeper or a cook, which was a very highly esteemed position, or a lady's maid.
But that position also had its own area of threat, which was the very real threat of rape. And,
yes.
And actually, one of the characters is Elizabeth, who on her first job working away is raped.
Yes.
So all of the degrees of sexual knowledge that you just listed did not include non-consensual, well, apart from the incest. But rape was also a huge factor in the story of the women that ended up, quote unquote, being fallen.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, I mean, many women ended up in their first sexual experiences as a result of what today we would identify as rape, because of the way society was structured, so that a man was always the dominant sexual person within any relationship. And in order for a man to demonstrate his masculinity, he had to, as some authors have called it, push his point. And a woman was always meant to protest her innocence. And this, what we're discussing here, is a dynamic of rape, of somebody overpowering somebody else. They called it seduction.
So we're setting in a scene of almost unremitting bleakness, I think you can gather. Did the women have any agency?
It depends what you describe as agency. I mean, there were ways to survive. You know, there are times in all of these women's lives where there are opportunities, where things improve for them, but then something militates against that and changes it. As I said, professionally, women could go into domestic service. That was a way in which a woman could change her fortune. But
I'm thinking of Kate.
yes.
Kate, who decides to become a kind of roving troubadour.
Yes.
Rather than take the traditional
That-
Victorian idealized female.
Yes.
Tell us about Kate.
Well, that's a very interesting story. Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim.
Oh, and about her dad as well.
And her father, yes. Catherine Eddowes' story is, again, very different. Each one of these stories took me on a journey when I was writing it that was so unique. Catherine Eddowes was born the daughter of a union agitator in Wolverhampton, in the Midlands, and he got into a lot of trouble for bringing a group of men out on strike with him. He was a tin worker, and at that time it was unlawful to strike, and so he was arrested, and he was sent to prison to walk what was called the tread wheel. You know, so you had to walk on this wheel. It was almost like a treadmill, as it was a type of physical punishment. And when he got out of prison, he had to move the whole family to London. And so Catherine...
Because he was blacklisted,
He was
presumably.
blacklisted. So Catherine and her sisters, and she was one of 12 children. One of 12 children. And this actually makes her story even more remarkable. So she was brought up in London, and she was chosen by her family, and we don't know why or what the circumstances were, for a charity school education. So women at this time, you know, by the middle of the 19th century, there was about a 50% illiteracy rate amongst women of all classes in the Victorian era. And Kate learned to read and write. She learned music. She was probably being prepared for domestic service. So she had some schooling. And unfortunately, both of her parents died by the time she was 15 of tuberculosis, that killer of so many people in the Victorian era. And she was sent away. She was sent back to her family in Wolverhampton. From there, she was given a factory job, and it was a terrible factory job. She was working with an acid bath. She was dipping silver and tin into acid to strip off all of the bits and pieces, and then polishing trays. And eventually she got sick of this and she ran away, and she went to live with another uncle who lived in Birmingham, and he was a part-time boxer. And she quite liked him and his family, but she found that her life didn't improve. She still had to work in a factory when she was living with him. And so she met a young man who was a strolling, well, a ballad seller. They were called chapmen at the time. And she threw her lot in with him, and they didn't get married. And they had each other's initials tattooed on each other's arms, which was, you know, quite, a shocking thing to do at the time.
It's a very sort of Hardy-esque love affair, isn't it?
It is a very Hardy-esque love affair. And they traveled the country selling and singing and writing ballads. Now, one of the interesting things I discovered about Catherine Eddowes was, obviously, she was literate, and Thomas Conway, her common law partner, was not literate, because I found his Olney records and he could not write his name. So if anybody was writing the ballads, it was Catherine writing the ballads. Eventually they moved to London. Things didn't go well. The relationship fell apart. He became very abusive, very violent, and she took up drinking. And eventually they parted.
But this just gives you a sense of the sort of breadth of the characters and of their experiences.
Yeah.
I want to add at this point that what I think you've done is taken something which is so iconic, this idea of Jack the Ripper, and it's almost a scene that we witnessed, and you've turned it around so that we can kind of look behind it at the props and it's like going backstage and seeing what it is that has built up. And I find that a quite wonderful thing, and I just had to drop that in. I want to talk. Do you consider this a feminist work?
That's so interesting. When I set out to write this book, the Me Too movement hadn't happened yet. So I was writing this, and then the Me Too movement happened around this. And so when the book came out, it was sort of carried on this wave of, oh my God, this is a Me Too book in many ways. It's a historical Me Too book because it's about reclaiming the voices of women who've been treated so badly, which is in many ways, well, what Me Too is all about. The book became a feminist book. I mean, how could it not? And by feminist, I mean it restores their voices to the historical canon. And that's something that I feel very, very strongly about, because I think certainly the way I was trained as a historian was largely that history, and it was changing, of course, by the time I was doing it, but what we're battling all the time is this concept of banner headline history, of the male experience. So we learn about the great generals, the wars, the kings, all of the people who are, the great men and the great deeds of great men. And I have always felt that history is more than this. History is the story of the little person. History is the story of everyday life. History is, we forget, is a humanities subject. And the word human, we forget that word human. It is the study of what it means to be human. And these women, I'm hoping, in having written this book, I've given them back their identity as human beings.
But in doing what you've done, which is almost to, do a history book version of a Lowry painting where you're looking at very ordinary people's lives, although they're extraordinary in their way too, but
all people's lives are extraordinary.
Everybody's life is extraordinary. There's a strong sort of democratic instinct in that, but you haven't made your life easy.
No, I haven't. Well, I mean, it's a really interesting thing about the response to this book. On one hand, I've had truly a phenomenal response. As a writer, when you're writing something, you never know how the public is going to receive it. You never know what people are going to say.
We're going to come to that, but I don't think I've phrased my question quite right. It didn't make life easy for you. How the hell did you do this? How did you go back and find and trace back not just these women's lives, but their parents? I mean, it's just extraordinary, the level of texture and detail that you've brought. Some of them must have been easier than others. If they were literate, for example, if they shifted jobs around. But as a job of work, to pull together a history like this must be extremely hard.
It is.
I want to know about the actual gritty.
It is extremely hard. It's extremely hard, but it's, I think people really take for granted what the historian's craft is and what it is that we do. Historians aren't just people who read and memorize books and facts. That's not history. That's the first entry point of history.
So what is history?
History is document analysis. It's looking at documents. It's weighing up documents. It's piecing together stories. It's about finding truth. And or a range of truths or a range of possibilities, especially with biography. When you're writing a biography of people who haven't left diaries and memoirs and all of these things we normally go to, you have to fall back on records. So things like birth and death records, workhouse records, censuses. I mean, things like censuses are full of the most extraordinary information. They open up a world where you can go down a street on a particular year and you can find who was living in a house, what jobs they did, how many children they had, how old those children were, where people were born, every little bit of information, who their neighbors were.
And is there an example that springs to mind of a particular document that you discovered or something that gave you a connection that, I mean, none of this was known previously, but...
Every single thing. I mean, the thing about history is you have to then take this information and then you have to center it in what we know already. So it gives you a range of possibilities for somebody. It gives you, it's like a data set, and you compare it against something else. I mean, I think, it's very interesting. For example, one of the censuses with Annie Chapman, the 1881 census. Annie was visiting her mother at the time, and she had her children with her. And one of the things we learn is that her youngest child was disabled. And we know that she was visiting her mother. We also know that at that time, Annie was really struggling with her alcoholism. Her husband was back on the country estate of his employer, working. But Annie gives her husband's profession as something called a stud groom. And this is really interesting because a stud groom is not just a coachman. A stud groom is the man who buys and looks after a gentleman's stable of racehorses, which means in society, he has a much more important role, and he spends time with gentlemen on the turf, in the racing world. He dines with gentlemen. This is a working class man who has worked his way up. And if you look at John Chapman, the way he describes himself.
So in one document there, you found her entire world aspiration, all her ambitions, what she wanted in life.
Exactly, there it is. Because he describes himself as a domestic servant. Of course, that's a summary of what he's doing. But this is Annie turning to the census enumerator and saying, I am the wife of a stud groom. And so it's all about, we get a sense of who these people are. It's all about how people perceive themselves in the world. We take it down to that very, very nitty-gritty level. You can get an idea of who these human beings were, what their expectations were, how they viewed life, how they viewed themselves.
So we've talked about what history is and your journey and collecting it together. But then, of course, what you've done is arrange it into stories. And I think what you've achieved that's remarkable is to manage in the face. We've described that we've painted a fairly desolate scene, but you managed to create a sort of non-tragedy at the end of each life somehow. And I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. So it's 5 lives in a row. And what Hallie's done is build up the threads to all the way up to the end of their life. And at the bit where the rest of history has been staring right in the face, that's when we look away. Very carefully done. But what was particularly beautiful, this one, Kate's death, we don't find out that, we know that she was hideously mutilated, but that's not where our gaze is. Where we leave Kate is that the whole family shows up. All the residents of Whitechapel give her a resounding send-off. Hundreds fill the streets on the 8th of October. In some places, the crowds were so thick, it slowed the progress of the hearse and the mourning carriage that followed behind it. At the cemetery where she was buried, nearly 500 people gathered to pay their respects, and among them were members of the Eddowes clan who had not seen each other in years. This family was pulled back together, now closing the empty space at their centre. So you managed to end on an up. Yeah. I mean, every death contributes something. No life is a total write-off. I still think that in writing this book, one of the things which is so incredible is that I personally feel that these women didn't die in vain anymore. I feel that we are learning from them. We're learning about who they were. We're using them as a way of understanding the Victorian era, of reflecting on our own time and women's position in our own society. I think they are teaching us things now, and it's an extraordinary experience to have channeled them into being. So you're reclaiming them as a non-tragedy. That's a sort of political act.
Yes.
Yeah.
I also think that, as a society, we are absolutely obsessed with murder. We are obsessed with true crime. People buy and read so much true crime. They're so interested in the narrative of the killer. But murder is about so much more than the killer. Murder is about the society that makes the killer and the society that makes the victim. And they are the same society. And the questions we have to ask are, what went so catastrophically wrong that our society or that society missed all the warning signs that allowed that killer to develop and that victim to develop simultaneously.
So this chimes very neatly, actually. I was in session yesterday with Anne Cleeves, the crime writer, who made a very similar point that, rapists/murderers aren't, these amazing monsters. They're just pathetic little awful men. And to reframe it this way, I think is an important act. I want to ask you, though, about, so a big part of the publicity is about the fact that, these women weren't prostitutes. And throughout history, it's always been, the one thing that we know about Jack the Ripper is that he killed prostitutes. And so you have shown time and time again the truth or not so much of this statement, which we can discuss. But one of the things that's come up in the reviews of this was that, is there a sort of almost a privileging in that, well, if you're saying that they're not prostitutes, does that mean they were less deserving of being murdered? In the publicity, and this is not your copy, but there's a note to editors I've got here. That only one of them worked as a sex worker and one of them worked as a high-class prostitute, as if to say, oh, well, but that's okay, the right kind of prostitute. So it's almost as if there's a hierarchy of victims, and I just wanted you to address that.
Well, that's not true at all. Obviously, the thing is, the truth is unpalatable. The truth is, we've always believed they are prostitutes. We prove that they were not prostitutes, and then suddenly, I get accused of being anti-sex worker. Well, that's like saying, so-and-so's been called a dentist all his life, but he's actually a doctor. Are you anti-dentist? For correcting that. No, it's simply correcting the record. That is, in fact, one of the things of all of the criticisms of this book. I always know when somebody's got completely the wrong end of the stick when they come at me with that, because they actually haven't read what I've written in the book when they come at me and say that. Because what I actually say in my closing chapter is they were human beings, they were women, and that is the most important thing. And in fact, that's what we've forgotten. It has nothing to do with whether or not they worked in the sex trade at all. However, it is extremely important to point out that if they were not actually sex workers, that we shouldn't call them that. Why should we? If that's what they weren't.
Absolutely. Now, we've left him right to the end, but Jack the Ripper, we do have to talk about him at a certain stage. And weirdly, I think it was about 5 years ago, I was here in the audience, and there was one of your Ripperologist friends doing a Ripper speech up here about, how Jack the Ripper was an Illuminati or I don't know what. And I remember even then, people in the audience felt that there was something quite pornographic about this presentation. How do you account for the persistence of this myth?
Because people are desperate to solve what they see as one of the greatest murder mysteries of all time.
With the addition of perviness.
Yeah, well, I think there is a perviness to it in some cases, but I think, this is a very, very fraught territory here. I have had major ructions with what is called Ripperology community.
Do they actually call themselves
Yes,
that?
they sure do. And they have basically accused me of lying. They've accused me of redacting documents. They've accused me of just ignoring information. It's completely untrue. What I have actually said, and what I will continue to say, and so many people ask me, oh, well, who do you think he was? And first of all, I will say it's irrelevant. And it's irrelevant because we will never know. And again, this is the thing. The historian's craft is so undervalued. I can look at those documents and I can say, there is not enough here to build a case for anything. These documents are perforated with holes. And what exists isn't factual. And the words I hear from Ripperologists is, you're ignoring the facts. No, I'm not ignoring the facts. Facts don't come from newspaper reports. Facts come from documents, and even then it's questionable. And if you don't apply that rigor to sources, you've got to think that newspapers are facts. And so when I say there isn't enough factual evidence to ever prove who Jack the Ripper was. They don't like that. And they don't like it that the one thing that I have alighted on and completely blown out of the water is their so-called fact that Jack the Ripper killed prostitutes.
Well, I suppose in a sense it threatens a whole industry. There was an attempt to build a museum.
Oh, well, they have built the museum. They have built that museum.
It's just an appalling kind of stretching out of this. I mean, what kind of name anyway? Jack, as in Jack the Lad. I mean, it's almost an affectionate term.
Yeah, well, it was at the time that his name was invented by the press at the time. And, you know, and there's always been a Ripper industry as well. Even from day one, from the first day of the murders, when people would go, when you would get local people taking journalists around to go and look at the murder site, and then the waxworks, and then the Jack the Ripper dolls. I mean, this was all 1888, and it's still going on now.
And it's not the only London tourist destination that features this story as well. There are numerous ones that you know, cast a lingering gaze on the sort of very barbaric treatment that was meted out on these women's bodies, which is why this is a very important book. I'm going to bring questions in now from the audience, so please raise your hand if there's something you'd like to ask. Have one in the middle. Anyone else, put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you very much for your interpretations. Myself is Umesh Prasad Singh. As a student of Victorian literature, I would like to say that there is a misconception about Victorian literature. It is related to humanism. Victorian literature is related to humanism and feminism, both combined. What we need to know that we have to strike a balance between humanism and feminism for direct understanding towards universality. This is what I feel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a question that's a question, please? There's one in the middle here. There's someone with their hand up. Oh, hello.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the session. My question was that throughout the session, we've just discussed lives of Annie and Kate. Can you just quickly tell us your one favorite thing about the rest of the three women?
My favorite thing. Oh, well, I would always say they are all of them. All five of them are interesting. So, I mean, here's some interesting things about them. Elizabeth Stride, the third victim, was from Sweden. She was a Swedish immigrant, and she had an immigrant's experience in London. When she came to London, she had left her family behind. She married. She worked as a servant, but she was also escaping great adversity because when she lived in Sweden, she had found herself in state-organized prostitution because of an illegitimate pregnancy. And she contracted syphilis, and she was treated for syphilis, and she miscarried her child, and she was never able to have children after that. And so she came to London to start her life anew, and she was, I think, incredibly courageous. And she also became a very, very adept fraudster. And she perpetrated a number of frauds on unsuspecting people in order to survive. And I found that fascinating about her. Polly Nichols was the wife of a printer, and she lived in one of the first social housing developments in London, which offered housing to the deserving poor. And unfortunately, she and her husband separated. But her story is the story of a woman who in the Victorian era was poor and could not afford a divorce. Divorce was not available. And so she fell through the safety net. There was no safety net. And she suffered as a result of that. And finally, Mary Jane Kelly, who was the youngest of the women. This is the thing. All of these women, we tend to think, oh, they were very young women because we have these Hollywood images of who they were. In fact, 4 of the 5 women were in their 40s when they were killed. And only one of them, Mary Jane Kelly, was 25. And Mary Jane Kelly had worked as a high-class sex worker. She worked in Knightsbridge. Lived and worked in Knightsbridge, and she was trafficked to Paris, and she escaped and came back and was hiding out in the East End when she was killed.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary story because you then start to explore European trafficking, which was also a thing. I did not know that.
People trafficking at the end of the 19th century was a thing. You develop faster methods of transportation, so steamships. That means you can get goods to market. Well, people are goods.
Any more questions? Lady on the front. And a microphone here, please, in the second row.
Hi. Post-publication, have you had any feedback from descendants or other interested parties?
Yes, I have. I've had the extraordinary experience of meeting descendants of these women, especially, well, Annie Chapman in particular. It was really, really remarkable. So I met Annie's great grandnephew, I guess that's what he would be called. He, amazingly, when I met him, you know, one of the only pictures that we have of these victims in life is of Annie Chapman on her wedding day. And Annie has these remarkable, kind of very round, striking blue eyes. And when I met Neil, her nephew, the first thing I noticed about him was he had these incredibly round blue eyes, and that was just amazing. And you know, it's been amazing making contact with some of the descendants.
Your question.
Hi.
A gentleman at the back with his hand up.
So my question is, you have reflected a lot about ladies, but I want to ask that, is that something that that was common in all 5 of them that made them land in such a position that, like, they all meet the same fate?
So yes, well, they were, well, a couple of things. They were women, but I think what really was their downfall was alcoholism. It was the thing that really undid all of them. All of them used alcohol at the time, varying degrees of alcoholism, but also the fact, you know, they were women, and society made it much more difficult for women who were poor to have, well, had almost no ability to self-determine, really. And that was really the primary problem, I think.
I suppose the one feeling that haunted me throughout and that unifies their lives above their being women is the precariousness. They are hanging by a thread.
Yeah.
And that's tremendously moving.
Yeah.
The gentleman's question down, yes.
Were you trying, or while you were researching, did you get some kind of a karmic connection as to why these women and not anybody else?
Do you mean why these women were chosen by him? Again, I think it's circumstance. It's completely about being victims of circumstance and the society, which literally didn't make it possible for these women to pull out of the kind of spiral that they had gone into. Society just didn't operate that way. You know, even things like for Annie Chapman in this rehabilitation center, rehabilitation, it was at a very, very early stage, and a lot of it was based on religion. So if you go to chapel 3 times a day, if you read the Bible, it will stop you from drinking. Well, we know today that's not how it works, but they didn't have, the Victorians operated within their own paradigm. They didn't have the ability to have the foresight that we do. You know, I don't know, they couldn't, there wasn't, I'm not sure if I'm doing justice to your question, sir, I'm afraid. But I don't know why they were chosen other than misfortune.
Well, it's partly because the book is about the women and not about Jack the Ripper.
Yes.
It's their lives.
Yeah.
And it makes such a living history. And I'm going to sneak this one in. Are you writing something similar? Are you working on some other
Yes, I am.
project? Can I ask about that? We will return to questions, but I do want to know what you're doing next.
I'm writing about the Crippen murder of 1910. So Dr. Crippen, who in England, Dr. Crippen, who was an American, and his wife, who was a music hall performer, who was also American, and he killed her and buried her under the stairs and ran off with his mistress dressed as a boy to Canada and was caught and brought back and tried and hanged. But the interesting thing about this story was a sensational story in 1910. But the amazing thing about it was, in fact, there was a group of women whose story has been erased. The women who brought him to justice, who caught him, the women who were part of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, which his wife belonged to. And also looking at the lives of his wife, looking at the life of his first wife, who he may have killed, and the life of his mistress as well.
There was a question here at the front, the lady in purple.
I'm glad you're still bringing down the villains. Hello. In your extensive research, did you have any sense that these women ever knew each other? That there was any connection at all?
Well, there's no verifiable connection between any of them. Obviously, they were all around the same place at the same time. They may have known each other in passing, but I work strictly from documents, and if it is not in the document, we cannot say it happened.
Any indication why Jack stopped?
No.
There's a question here. The person in black.
So, in recent years, we don't hear too much about these kinds of things happening. Like, this is not a very common thing that comes in headlines. So, as you said, a society plays a very big role in the psyche of a person. So, how do you think the society has changed from that time to now? And if it hasn't changed, and do you know, like most of the signs you can see from a very early on age, some tormenting thing happened that plays in a serial killer's mind. So how do we like stay away from them?
How do we avoid serial killers? Is that a good summary of your question? How do we, how have things changed? How do we, it's a very good question. I mean, I think the problem is, as long as we are prepared to turn a blind eye to suffering, to people who are on the margins of society, those people will always be targeted. As long as we are not willing to help, to outstretch our hands to those less fortunate, to care about those within our communities, those people will always be at risk. I think, you know, those types of circumstances make both the serial killer and the victim.
Another question, please. We need to get microphones to people that have their hands up. There was someone waiting for a long time in the middle there.
Good afternoon. So my mom's super worried with how obsessed I've been with Jack the Ripper since I was a kid. So that's irrelevant. However, I'd like to ask you that, do you think his MO included all these impoverished or, say, destitute or, say, women in the sex trade and all of that? Do you think that's more than just a coincidence that he took up those victims so that, well, comparing the societal prejudice, he thought that their cases would be easily predisposed? Do you think that's a possibility?
Because, you mean because nobody would care about them?
Yeah. And people would also say that, well, they deserved it. So do you think that's...
Well, also, I don't even know if it was that well planned. Because I think in many cases, my only, you know, if people press me and they say, well, what conclusions can you tell me about the killer? The only thing that I would say is I can say almost with 100% certainty that he was, you know, this image that we have of Jack the Ripper, the man with the top hat and the cape, he was not a toff. He was not from outside of the society in which he killed. He knew Whitechapel too well. He knew the back roads. The reality is what I found, and certainly what I postulate in my book, is, in fact, all of these women, with the exception of one, Elizabeth Stride, which we're not sure about, he killed in their sleep. So I mean, there was absolutely no way. You know, Jack the Ripper did not have sex with his victims. It was proven at the time there was no sexual communication whatsoever between them, no sexual contact. They were all killed in reclining positions. What we know, there was an enormous homeless population at the time. And all of those women were known to be homeless and rough sleepers. And so that is more likely to have connected them. That and alcoholism and the fact that they were women and the fact that there was no safety net for them all conspired together to create the circumstances of their death.
There was another question in the middle.
I'd just like to say I think it's great what you're doing, because I remember the Yorkshire Ripper and the fake focus on the victims there, that they were vilified as well in the press. And I hope you do some more stories like this to support the women who are victims of crime. Thank you.
Thank you.
I definitely second that. We've got time for one more question, although that was a nice high point to end on. There's someone with their hand up here.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and I think that's really good work done. I would really just want to know one thing. What was the community's reaction after all these murders took place? Do you have any clue about the reactions?
Yeah, everybody was horrified and terrorized. People were absolutely terrified of Jack the Ripper. And in fact, nobody knew why it was that the murders ended. Nobody knew why he stopped killing. I mean, we may never know why. We probably will never know why. But for many years afterwards, and certainly what contributed to the mystique of Jack the Ripper, is that people did not know if he was going to kill again. And so the community remained on high alert for some time afterwards. So this was 1888, well into the early 1890s. When my family lived in Whitechapel, there was concern about that. So it's, and I think that's probably why the legacy of these murders lives on as well. It's because we never really outgrown this sense of fear. There's the lack of conclusion about this story. But one of the things that I will always say and always argue is it is irrelevant who Jack the Ripper was. What is the most important thing, the way in which we bring closure to this, is we remember the victims. We remember who they were. We remember Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate, and Mary Jane.
On that note, thank you very much, Hallie. This has been an amazing presentation. And thank you for giving these women their voices back. This is a really important and humane work, and I urge you to rush to the author's signing and to get your signed copy of Hallie's brilliant book, The Five. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
In order to close the session, we have a small announcement. The Z Jaipur Literature Festival is proud to partner with AirAsia India, part of the Tata Group, in an initiative to raise awareness about climate change. Together, we are creating a literature forest in Karnataka, and we're planting individual trees in honor of the speakers at the festival. So we are presenting our speakers this afternoon with certificates to honor this initiative. Huge thanks to Hallie Rubenhold and B. Rowlatt. This session was brought to you by Rajasthan Patrika as part of the Leadership Series. And as B said, Hallie Rubenhold will be signing her book. It's available at the JCB Prize for Literature bookshop, managed by Full Circle. You'll find the bookshop next to the Charbagh venue on the left-hand side. And Hallie will be signing books here at the back of the Nexa front lawn in our author signing area, which is the Z kiosk in the far right corner here. We're going to take a half-hour break here at the front lawn, and we will be setting up for the closing debate, which is a tradition at the Z Jaipur Literature Festival every year to bring the festival to a conclusion. And the subject for the debate this year is has social media divided society? While we're doing the turnaround, I'll read through our sponsor list one last time. It's a very long list, but we are incredibly grateful to all the organizations and companies that contribute to making this festival what it is today. Z is the title partner, Nexa the associate partner, and venue partner for Front Lawn. Bank of Baroda is the venue partner for Betak. Motwani Jadeja Foundation is the venue partner for the Durbar Hall. Rajasthan Tourism is our tourism partner. Aga Khan Foundation is our series partner. Renkit Benkaiser is our official cause partner. Diageo, our celebration partner. AirAsia, our travel partner. Kingfisher, our good times partner. Red FM, our official radio partner. Lontrora, our podcast partner. Facebook, our community partner. Be Live, our webcast partner. UFO Movies, our cine media partner. Save the Children has provided book launches. Pratam Books is an outreach partner. And the JCB Prize for Literature Festival Bookstore is managed by Full Circle. Series partners are the North India office of the US Embassy in New Delhi and Mahindra World City, Jaipur. Session partners are British Council, Netflix, Etsy, Public Health Engineering Department, United Nations, India, Avid Learning, Murti Classical Library of India of Harvard University Press, the Australian High Commission and Australia Council for the Arts, Paras Buildtech, Sahitya Academy, Centre for Policy Research. Media partners are Dainik Bahaskar, Rajasthan Patrika, Amar Ujala, Business Standard, Inox, Matrubhumi, Outlook Magazine, The New Indian Express, and The Tribune. Further sponsors are Jan Mikulski, Zomato, DLF, Penguin Random House, Jay Shri Periwal International School, Citibank, Storytel, CK Birla Hospital, LIC, India Sotheby's International Realty, State Bank of India, John L. Bissell Foundation, J.W. Marriott, Airtel, Karma Kettle, Grover Zampa, Coca-Cola, Gulmora Lane, Hotel Digi Palace for providing this wonderful, wonderful venue, which is really the heart and soul of the festival, and we love Digi Palace so much. Taj Rambagh Palace, Clark's Amir, Royal Opera House, Mumbai, the Lalit Full Circle, Yuva Ekta Foundation, Royal Treasure, Eventbot, Edelman, Social Connect, McCain, Unibic, Wagbakriti, Maskin, and Kanha Sweets. Once again, at 5:15, we'll be hosting the closing debate here at the 2020 Z Jaipur Literature Festival in association with Nexa. The subject for the debate is Social Media Has Divided Society. We look forward to seeing you then.